The world was teeth and hunger, cloaked in a shroud of ancient green and shadowed stone. For the Sunstone people, life was a rhythm beaten out between the rising of the day star and its fall, a desperate dance with the seasons. Their home was a crescent-shaped valley, carved by a glacier in a time before memory, cradled by towering granite cliffs that wept waterfalls in the spring and wore shawls of ice in the winter. The River of Teeth, a cold, swift current, bisected their land, offering fish in its shallows and danger in its depths. At the heart of their territory, nestled into the valley's most formidable cliff face, was the Great Cave, a yawning maw of darkness that had been their sanctuary for generations uncounted. Its walls were their memory, a tapestry of ochre and charcoal depicting hunts of ghost mammoths, herds of long-horned bison, and the shadowy figures of their ancestors, their handprints like spectral leaves pressed against the cold stone. The end of the warm cycle was approaching. The air, once thick with the drone of insects and the scent of pollen, now carried a sharp, clean edge that spoke of coming frost. The leaves on the birch and aspen that clung to the lower slopes of the valley had begun their slow bleed from vibrant green to fiery gold and blood red. For the Sunstone people, this was the time of greatest anxiety and greatest hope. It was the time of the long hunt, the final push to gather enough meat and fat to survive the White Death, the merciless rain of winter when the world fell silent and still under a blanket of snow. And it was the time that preceded the festival of the new moon. Cale felt the change not just in the air, but in his bones. He was a young man, perched on the cusp of full manhood, yet he felt older than his 18 summers. Unlike the other young hunters, whose bodies were thick slabs of muscle and whose laughter was loud and uncomplicated, Cale was built of leaner stuff. His limbs were long and wiry, his movements quiet and observant. His eyes, the color of moss in deep shade, missed little. Where others saw a simple forest, Cale saw a complex language. The scuff of a deer's hoof, the discarded shell of a nut revealing the passage of a squirrel, the subtle shift in a bird's call that signaled a predator's approach. He carried a spear with competence, but his true tools were his eyes and his mind. This quiet nature set him apart. The tribe's premier hunter, a bull of a man named Rorik, often mocked him. Rorik was all strength and bravado, his face a mask of scars from a close encounter with a cave lion, his voice a gravelly roar that commanded attention. To Rorik, hunting was a battle of wills, a physical conquest. He saw Cale's thoughtful hesitation as weakness, his silent observation as cowardice. The boy stares at the beast until it dies of boredom. Rorik would jest to the other hunters, who would grunt in amusement. Cale would simply clench his jaw and turn away, his frustration a hot coal in his belly. He knew he could not match Rorik's brute force, but he also knew there was more to survival than the strength of one spear arm. The tension in the tribe was palpable, as taut as a stretched sinew. The long hunt was not going well. The great herds of bison and red deer, usually plentiful in the lower valley at this time of year, were scarce. The hunters returned day after day, their shoulders slumped, their leather satchels holding only a few rabbits or a brace of game birds, hardly enough to sustain the 30 souls of the tribe, let alone build the stores for the White Death. A gnawing hunger had begun to settle in the camp, a quiet dread that manifested in the pinched faces of the mothers and the fretful cries of the children. Borin, the chieftain, was a man weathered by 60 winters, his face a roadmap of every joy and sorrow the tribe had endured. He sat by the central fire, his gaze lost in the flames, the weight of his people's survival pressing down on him. He listened to the reports, his silence a heavy blanket over the camp. Rorik, as always, had a simple explanation. "The spirits are displeased," he declared one evening, his voice echoing in the great cave. He slammed the butt of his heavy flint-tipped spear onto the stone floor. "We have grown soft. We rely on the boys' clever traps and the women's digging for roots. A tribe's strength is in its hunters. We must make a great offering. We must show the Sky Father and the Hunt Mother that we are still worthy, that our spears are still sharp and our hearts are still brave." Many of the men grunted in agreement. Fear was a fertile ground for simple, aggressive solutions. They looked at Rorik's powerful frame and saw security. They looked at their dwindling stores of dried meat and saw validation for his words. Kale listened from the shadows, his hands busy sharpening a flint arrowhead. He disagreed, but he knew his voice held little weight in this council of hardened men. He believed the spirits were not angry, but that the world was simply changing. He had noticed subtle shifts Rorik had missed. The acorns were smaller this year. The river ran lower. A different kind of bird, one he had never seen before, had appeared in the high branches. The world was speaking, but Rorik was too busy shouting to listen. The only one who seemed to understand his perspective was Alara, the tribe's storykeeper. Alara was ancient, her age a thing of myth. Some said she had seen the last of the ghost mammoths walk the valley. Her skin was a fine parchment of wrinkles, her eyes clouded with the white haze of age, but her mind was a library of generations. She held the tribe's soul in her memory, the genealogies, the laws, the rituals, and, most importantly, the stories. She was the living link to the ancestors whose hands decorated the cave walls. She summoned Kale to her side, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "They listen to the roar of the bear," she said, her blind eyes seeming to look straight through him. "But they forget the wisdom of the spider, who weaves its home with patience and silence. The world does not always yield to a heavy spear, young one." Kale felt a warmth spread through his chest. To be seen, truly seen, by Alara was a greater honor than any praise from Rorik. "The herds have moved on," Kale said quietly. "I followed their tracks. They did not flee from a predator. They are heading north, towards the high pass. I do not know why." Alara nodded slowly, her head a fragile, nodding flower on its thin stalk. "The world changes. The great cycle turns. The ancestors knew this. They did not fight the river. They learned its currents. The festival of the new moon is near. It is more than a time for feasting and chanting, Kale. It is a time for listening." The festival of the new moon was the most sacred time in the Sunstone calendar. It occurred on the cusp of the first winter snow during the 3 nights of the dying moon, when the sky was a black, star-dusted void, empty of its luminous guide. It was a time of profound darkness, a symbolic death of the world before the slender, silver promise of the new moon's crescent heralded its rebirth. The tribe believed that during these 3 dark nights, the veil between the world of the living and the spirit world was at its thinnest. It was a time to honor the ancestors, to seek their guidance, and to renew the pact between the people and the spirits of the land that sustained them. Preparations for the festival were a ritual in themselves, a communal effort that temporarily eased the gnawing tension of the failing hunt. The women and children fanned out across the valley floor, their woven baskets slowly filling with the sacred elements. They gathered blood-red hawthorn berries, which represented the life force of the tribe. They dug for the roots of the moonflower, a pale, gnarled root that, when dried and burned, produced a thick, sweet-smelling smoke said to carry prayers to the spirit world. They collected clusters of spirit stone smooth, white quartz pebbles from the riverbed that would be arranged in circles around the ceremonial fire to represent the eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Kale was tasked with a solitary and vital duty, gathering the pigments for the festival's final ritual. This was a task usually reserved for the storykeeper's apprentice, and Alara had chosen him. It was a silent acknowledgement of his unique sensibilities. He journeyed to the sacred places known only to a few. He went to the Ochre Creek, where the clay banks bled a spectrum of reds and yellows, from the pale yellow of the morning sun to the deep, dark red of clotted blood. He scraped the precious clay into leather pouches, his fingers feeling the cool, silken texture. He traveled to the charred remains of an ancient, lightning-struck pine tree to gather charcoal, the blackness of which represented the void, the darkness of the new moon, the time of deep listening. Finally, he climbed to a small, hidden cave where mineral deposits left chalky white streaks on the walls, the color of bone and spirit of the ancestors themselves. As he worked, his mind was not on the festival's chants or dances, but on the mystery of the herds. Why had they left? Rorik's theory of displeased spirits felt too simple, too human. Spirits, as Alara's stories taught, were forces of nature, as impersonal as the wind or the frost. They did not feel anger as a man did. They simply were. An imbalance had occurred. A thread in the great tapestry had been pulled, and the herds had moved in response. But what was the thread? On his return to the camp, laden with his precious pigments, he found the atmosphere had soured further. Another hunting party had returned, led by Rorik, and they were not just empty-handed, but wounded. A young hunter named Tarak had a deep, ragged gash on his thigh, his face pale and slick with the sweat of pain. They had found the trail of a lone, massive elk, a beast large enough to feed the tribe for a week. They had tracked it for hours, deeper into the tangled woods at the base of the northern cliffs. But they were not the only hunters. As they closed in, they were ambushed. Shadow cats, Rorik snarled, recounting the tale to a grim-faced Borin. A mated pair, silent as falling snow. They came from the rocks above. They were not hunting the elk. They were hunting us. The tribe murmured in fear. Shadowcats, great, saber-toothed hunters, were the apex predators of the valley, creatures of nightmare. They were brutally strong, impossibly fast, and cunning. A single one was a deadly threat. A pair was a death sentence. Rorik's party had only escaped by the sheer luck of Tarak's spear finding its mark in the female's shoulder, wounding it and making the pair retreat into the shadows to protect their own. But they had lost the elk and nearly lost a man. The failed hunt was now a terrifying omen. They have never hunted so close to the cave before, Borin mused, his voice heavy with worry. They keep to the high rocks, the deep woods. It is a sign, Rorik insisted, his voice rising. He pointed a finger at Kale, who was standing near the entrance of the cave. The spirits have sent the Shadowcats to punish our weakness. We spend our days gathering pigments and listening to old stories while our children's bellies ache with hunger. We must act. We must perform the ritual of the spear tomorrow night, on the first night of the festival. We will offer the blood of our bravest to the Hunt Mother and ask her to guide our spears and blind our enemies. The ritual of the spear was an old, desperate rite, performed only in the direst of times. It involved a ceremonial hunt, not for meat, but for a spiritual victory. The hunters would work themselves into a trance through chanting and dancing, then venture into the darkness to confront a great beast, believing their ritual fervor would grant them spiritual protection. It was incredibly dangerous, a gamble of life against fate. Borin looked from Rorik's fanatical, zealous face to the pale, worried faces of his tribe. He saw the fear in their eyes. He felt the cold breath of the coming winter. His pragmatism was at war with the rising tide of superstition. The festival is a time for listening, not for shouting, a quiet voice said. All heads turned. Alara had emerged from her small alcove within the great cave, leaning heavily on a staff of polished yew. Though her eyes could not see, her presence commanded an authority that even Rorik could not easily dismiss. The ancestors did not survive the great ice by challenging the storm, she continued, her voice thin but clear as a shard of flint. They survived by finding shelter. They did not fight the Shadowcat in its own territory. They learned its ways and avoided its path. The festival's first night is for remembering. We will tell the great story. We will honor those who came before. We will ask for their wisdom, not demand their blessing with blood. A tense silence fell over the cave. It was a conflict between two opposing philosophies of survival: the aggressive, confrontational path of Rorik and the patient, observant path of Alara. Borin, the chieftain, was caught in the middle. He was a man of action, and Rorik's plan appealed to his desire to do something. But he had led his people for many years by listening to Alara's counsel, and her wisdom had rarely failed them. We will follow the old ways, Borin decided at last, his voice firm. The first night will be as Alara says. We will remember. We will listen. Then we will decide what is to be done. Rorik shot a venomous glare first at Alara, then at Kale, as if blaming him for the old woman's influence. He spun on his heel and stalked away to the far side of the cave, his followers shuffling awkwardly behind him, their discontent a palpable force in the flickering firelight. Cale felt a profound sense of unease. The tribe was fracturing. The hunger was not just in their stomachs. It was in their spirit, eating away at the unity that had kept them alive for so long. He looked at the pouches of pigment at his feet, the red of life, the black of the void, the white of the ancestors. These were meant to be tools of communion, of bringing the tribe together to face the darkness as one. Now, they felt like symbols of a division that was growing as deep and as cold as the coming winter. That night, as the last sliver of the old moon vanished from the sky, a profound and complete darkness fell upon the valley. The stars seemed brighter, colder, impossibly distant. The wind whispered through the pines with a mournful sound, like the sighs of ghosts. It was the first of the 3 nights. The festival of the new moon had begun. Inside the great cave, the main fire was allowed to burn down to a bed of glowing orange embers, casting a soft, warm light that pushed back the immense, breathing darkness of the deeper caverns. The Sunstone people gathered in a circle. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the tangy aroma of the burning moonflower root, which Alara had placed upon the coals. The smoke curled upwards, a fragrant offering to the unseen world. Alara sat near the fire, her frail body wrapped in a heavy bison hide. Her blind eyes were turned towards the cave mouth, as if watching the blackness of the world outside. Cale sat near her, his role to tend the smoke and to be her hands and feet if she needed anything. He felt the weight of every person's gaze, the heavy silence of their collective anxiety. Before we were the Sunstone people, Alara began, her voice gaining a surprising resonance in the hush. We were nothing. We were scattered sparks in the great darkness, cold and afraid. The Sky Father was a distant, cold eye, and the Earth Mother was a frozen breast. There was no fire, no spear, no story. She paused, letting the weight of that primordial emptiness settle over them. The children huddled closer to their mothers. The hunters, even Rorik, were still and attentive. This was the great story, the heart of their identity, and to hear it from Alara was to touch the beginning of time. Then came the first ancestors, she continued, born not from a womb, but from the heart of a mountain during a storm. They did not know how to hunt or how to speak or how to love. They only knew hunger and fear. They saw the great beasts, the ghost mammoth with its fur of snow, the cave bear as large as a hill, the shadow cat with teeth like daggers of ice. They hid from them, cowering in crevices and holes in the ground. Cale watched the faces of his people in the firelight. He saw the story reflected in their eyes. They were not just hearing words. They were reliving the terror and fragility of their origins. One night, Alara said, her voice dropping to a whisper, the darkest night of the year, when the moon was eaten by the sky, the first mother was lost in a blizzard. She was freezing, her life fading. She fell into a snowdrift, ready to sleep the final sleep. But as she lay dying, a light appeared. It was a single wolf, its eyes glowing like embers. It was the spirit wolf, the first friend to humankind. It did not attack her. It lay beside her, sharing its warmth. And in her desperation, the first mother did not see a predator. She saw a fellow creature, a survivor. She saw family. The spirit wolf led her to a cave, and inside, it showed her a miracle. A dead tree, struck by lightning from a summer storm, still held a glowing, hot coal in its heartwood. The first mother took the coal, cradling it in moss and bark, and brought it back to her people. This was the first fire. It gave them warmth, it pushed back the darkness, and it kept the great beasts at bay. Alara gestured with a trembling hand towards the central fire. This fire is the child of that fire. It is our heart. It is our memory of the first gift. With the fire came courage, she went on, her voice growing stronger. The first father, seeing the courage of his mate, learned to watch the spirit wolf. He saw how it hunted, not with brute strength alone, but with patience, with cunning, with the strength of the pack. He learned to read tracks, to understand the wind, to work with his brothers. He chipped the first flint into a sharp point. He bound it to a shaft of ash wood. This was the first spear. She pointed a finger towards Rorik. The spear is not a tool of rage, Hunter. It is a tool of wisdom born from observation. It is our memory of the first lesson. Rorik shifted, his expression unreadable in the dim light. And with warmth and food, Elara concluded, her voice softening, came the first quiet moments, the moments after the hunt, by the warmth of the fire, with bellies full. In that quiet, the first mother looked at the wall of her cave. She took a piece of charcoal from the fire, and she drew the spirit wolf, to remember its gift. She took the red earth and drew the bison, to thank it for its life. This was the first story. It was a story that said, "We are here. We remember. We are grateful. It is our soul." Her hand swept to indicate the magnificent, spectral menagerie that covered the walls around them. The leaping deer, the thundering bison, the haunting outlines of their own hands. These walls are that story, written over and over again. They remind us of who we are. They are our memory of the first miracle, that we survived. Silence descended again, deeper this time. It was a silence filled with awe and a renewed sense of shared history. The story had worked its magic, knitting them back together, reminding them that they were the children of a miracle, the inheritors of a legacy of survival forged in darkness and ice. They were not just a collection of hungry, frightened individuals. They were the Sunstone people. Cale felt a profound shift within himself. He had always loved the paintings, but now he saw them with new eyes. They were not just pictures. They were a language. They were a pact. They were a prayer made of pigment and stone. He understood his task of gathering the colors was not just a chore. It was the work of a scribe, a priest preparing the sacred ink. The moment was broken by a sharp cry from the sentry posted at the cave mouth. "Something comes." Instantly, the men were on their feet, spears in hand. Rorik was the first to the entrance, peering out into the impenetrable black. Borin was at his side, his own spear held ready. The women pulled the children behind them, their faces stark with fear. The fragile unity of the story was shattered by the raw immediacy of a threat. "I hear nothing," Rorik growled, straining his ears. The wind moaned, a lonely sound. "A footstep," the sentry insisted, his voice shaking. "One. Heavy. And then, nothing." They waited, a silent, tense tableau, for what felt like an eternity. The only sounds were the crackle of the embers and the ragged breathing of the frightened children. The darkness outside the cave seemed to have grown thicker, more menacing. It was no longer an empty void. It was a presence, a listening, waiting thing. After a long time, Borin gave a low signal to stand down, but to remain alert. The men returned to the circle, but the spell was broken. Fear had returned, cold and sharp. The story had reminded them of how they had survived, but the sound in the darkness reminded them of how easily they could perish. Cale looked at Elara. The old woman had not moved. Her face was calm, her head cocked as if listening to a conversation he could not hear. "The world speaks, Cale," she whispered, so low only he could hear. "Even in the deepest dark. The question is, are we listening to the right story?" As the tribe settled into a fitful, uneasy watch for the remainder of the night, Cale felt her words sink into his soul. Rorik believed the world was telling a story of anger and punishment, one that required a response of blood and violence. But Elara, and the paintings, and the quiet voice in his own heart, suggested another story entirely. It was a story of connection, of balance, of observation. His people were at a crossroads, and the path they chose would determine their fate. The festival of the new moon was meant to be a time of renewal, but he was consumed by a chilling premonition that it might, instead, be their end. The whispering dark held the answer, but he did not yet know how to hear it. The blackness of the first night gave way not to a vibrant dawn, but to a slow, reluctant seepage of gray light. The world emerged from the dark as if drained of color, the granite cliffs looking like ancient bones and the sky a sheet of unpolished pewter. A cold, damp mist clung to the valley floor, muffling sound and swallowing the distant landscape. It was a bone-white day, a day for ghosts and ill omens. Inside the great cave, the tension from the night before had not dissipated. It had congealed, like blood in a wound. The mysterious footstep had given form to their collective fear. It was no longer a faceless dread of starvation, but a specific, lurking terror in the shadows just beyond the firelight. Rorik and his followers were vindicated, their belief in a tangible, malevolent force now given weight. The more cautious members of the tribe, who had found comfort in Alara's story, now cast worried glances towards the cave entrance, their faith shaken. Borin, his face etched with sleeplessness, knew he had to act. Inaction was a poison that would allow fear to fester and Rorik's influence to grow unchecked. "We will see what came to our door," he announced, his voice a low command that cut through the nervous whispers. "Rorik, Kale, you come with me. And you, Fun, your eyes are sharp. We leave now, before the sun is high enough to burn away the tracks." Rorik grunted his assent, his hand already gripping the thick shaft of his spear. He looked energized, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. This was his element. A clear threat, a direct confrontation. Kale nodded silently, his stomach a tight knot of apprehension. He felt that finding the source of the sound would not bring clarity, but rather deepen the schism that was tearing them apart. They moved out of the cave's comforting warmth into the biting chill of the morning. The mist swirled around their legs, the damp ground soft and silent under their hide-wrapped feet. The sentry from the previous night led them to the spot where he had heard the sound, a small clearing of flattened grass just beyond the main game trail leading to the river. At first, they saw nothing. The ground was a mess of damp leaves and scattered pebbles. Fawn, a wiry hunter with a gift for tracking, circled the area like a patient wolf, his eyes scanning every inch of the earth. Rorik paced impatiently, kicking at a loose stone. "A shadow, a falling rock," he scoffed. The boy was spooked by the dark. "No," Finn said, his voice hushed. He pointed with the tip of his spear. "Here." Borin and the others gathered around. There, pressed deep into a patch of soft, muddy earth, was a single terrifying track. It was immense, far larger than the paw print of a shadow cat, wider than a man's chest. It was vaguely ursine, but possessed a wrongness that made the hair on Kale's arms stand on end. There were 5 deep gouges in the earth at its leading edge, claw marks that were not curved like a bear's but were long and almost straight, like the tips of sharpened spears driven into the ground. The sheer depth of the print spoke of a creature of unimaginable weight. And most unnerving of all, there was only one. The creature had placed 1 foot here, and then, seemingly, vanished. A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the cold air. "What beast makes such a mark?" Borin whispered, his weathered face pale. Rorik let out a harsh, triumphant laugh that was devoid of humor. "Beast? That is no beast of this world, old man. This is the track of a demon, a spirit of the cold dark, sent to test us. The Hunt Mother is angry. The Sky Father has turned his face away. I told you, the spirits demand a sacrifice. They demand a show of strength." He turned to face them, his eyes wild. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a prophet of doom, and he had found his sign. "The ritual of the spear is our only chance. We must anoint ourselves in blood and courage and face this evil. We must prove we are not afraid." Kale knelt, ignoring Rorik's sermon. His mind worked differently. He did not see a demon's print. He saw a puzzle. He ran his fingers along the edge of the impression, feeling the displaced soil. The weight was immense, yes, but the pattern of the pressure was strange. He looked around, his eyes taking in the entire scene. He saw what the others, in their fear, had missed. A few feet away, the thick branch of an ancient oak tree was broken, the wood splintered and white. The break was fresh. Higher up on the trunk, long parallel scratches ran deep into the bark. It stood up, Cale said, his voice quiet but firm. Rorik stopped his tirade and glared at him. "What did you say, boy?" "It stood up on its hind legs," Cale repeated, pointing. "It put one foot here for leverage. It reached up and broke that branch. See the claw marks on the trunk. It was testing its strength or marking its territory. It is a creature of this world. It is flesh and blood." Rorik sneered. "Flesh and blood? What bear grows so large? What beast have you ever seen that could snap an oak branch as thick as your thigh? You see with the eyes of a child, Cale. You see a puzzle because you are too afraid to see the truth. This is a message from the spirits. The spirits do not leave muddy tracks," Cale countered, his voice rising with a rare show of defiance. "Enough!" Boren roared, stepping between them. His authority, though strained, was still absolute. He stared at the track for a long moment, then at the broken branch. He was a practical man, but the sheer size and strangeness of the sign preyed on his deep-seated beliefs. Fear was a more powerful argument than logic. "We return to the cave," he said, his voice heavy. "We will discuss this. Rorik, your ritual will be considered for the final night." It was a concession, but for Rorik it was a victory. He shot Cale a look of pure triumph before turning and striding back towards the camp, his followers falling in line behind him. Cale remained kneeling for a moment longer, staring at the monstrous footprint. He felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with demons or angry spirits. He felt the dread of a mouse that has just found the track of an eagle. Something was terribly wrong with the balance of their world, and Rorik's answer was to run screaming towards it with a sharp stick. Back in the great cave, the discovery of the track sent a wave of panic through the tribe. Rorik seized the momentum, his voice a constant, booming presence. He described the track with theatrical embellishments, calling it a hole burned into the earth by a foul spirit. He spoke of the coming White Death not as a season, but as a curse that they must break with an act of supreme, violent faith. The younger hunters, frustrated by their failures and frightened by the strange omens, were drawn to his certainty, to the simple, alluring promise that action could conquer fear. Boren, seeing the mood of his people, did little to stop him. The tribe needed hope, and Rorik, in his aggressive way, was offering it. The alternative Cale's quiet insistence on an unknown, flesh-and-blood creature offered only a different, more tangible kind of fear, with no clear path to victory. The day wore on, heavy and oppressive. The women worked to treat Turok's wound, which was now inflamed and seeping, his skin hot to the touch. His fevered moans provided a grim soundtrack to Rorik's fiery speeches. The failure of the hunt, the encroaching winter, the injured hunter, and now the demon track, all were threads Rorik wove together into a tapestry of impending doom that only he, through the ancient ritual, could unmake. Cale felt isolated, a ghost in his own home. He tried to speak to some of the other hunters, to point out the logic of the broken branch, but they waved him away. Rorik's fear was more compelling than his reason. Defeated, he retreated to the only place he might find an ally, the smoky alcove where Alara sat, her hands methodically grinding pigments in a shallow stone bowl. He described the track in precise detail: its size, its depth, the shape of the claws. He told her about the broken branch and the claw marks on the tree. He did not speak of demons or spirits, only of what he had seen. Alara listened without interruption, her blind eyes fixed on some point in the darkness of the cave wall. The rhythmic grinding of her stone pestle was the only sound. When Cale finished, the grinding stopped. "There are stories," she said, her voice a dry whisper, "that are not told around the great fire. There are stories kept for the deep winter, stories that are so old they have the frost of the great ice still clinging to them. They are not stories of our people, the Sunstone people, but of the people who came before, the ones who painted the ghost mammoths in the deepest, darkest parts of this cave." Cale leaned closer, captivated. He had always wondered about the oldest, faded paintings in the places no one ever went. "They tell of a time," Alara continued, "when the White Death was not just a season, but the way of the world. A time when ice sheets as tall as mountains ground the stone to dust. In that time of cold, there were monsters. Not spirits, Kale. Monsters of bone and fur and hunger. The greatest of these was Ursus Major, the great-grandfather. The white bear of the mountain. A creature so large it was said to hunt the woolly rhinos and that even the shadow cats fled from its scent. Kale's blood ran cold. You think this track? The old stories say the great-grandfather sleeps for 100 winters at a time in the heart of the mountain that sleeps, she said, gesturing vaguely towards the northern cliffs. He only wakes when the world is deeply unbalanced, when the long cold is about to return. He is not a demon, Kale. He is a season. He is a force of nature. An omen, yes, but not of a spirit's anger. An omen of a change in the world itself, a change far greater than our small tribe. This was a truth far more terrifying than Rorik's demon. A demon could be fought, appeased. But how do you fight a season? How do you fight the turning of the entire world? The herds? Kale breathed, the realization striking him like a physical blow. They did not leave because of us. They are fleeing him, his scent, his presence. They are trying to escape the valley before he claims it. And the shadow cats, Elara added, her voice grim. Their hunting grounds in the high rocks have been usurped. They are pushed down into our lands, hungry and desperate. They hunt us now because their world has been broken. Everything clicked into place. It was a chain reaction, an ecological cascade of fear. And his tribe was at the very end of that chain. Rorik's ritual, Kale said, his voice shaking with urgency. If they go out there, chanting and bleeding, seeking a demon, they will find this great bear. It will be a slaughter. Yes, Elara said simply. I have to stop them. I have to show them the truth. How? The old woman asked. Rorik has their fear. You only have a story they have forgotten. Fear is a shout, Kale. A story is a whisper. To be heard, you must give your whisper the weight of stone. You must bring them proof. What proof? Alara's wrinkled hand reached out, her fingers finding his arm with surprising strength. The stories say that when the great-grandfather wakes, he first goes to the Weeping Caves on the northern ridge. He goes there to drink the mineral-rich water that drips from the stone, to regain the strength he lost in his long sleep. The caves are a forbidden place. Bad spirits are said to dwell there. But the old people knew it was the bear's place. They knew to stay away. She leaned closer, her breath smelling of moonflower root and ancient dust. Go there. Look for what is broken. A creature of that size cannot move without leaving its mark. Find the proof, Kale. Bring it back. Be the eyes for those who refuse to see. The mission was terrifying. To venture alone into the territory of such a creature, into a place forbidden by tribal taboo, was madness. But the thought of Rorik leading the tribe's best hunters to their deaths was a far greater terror. Kale looked at the faces of his people across the fire, saw their fear, their desperation, and the dangerous, false hope Rorik was feeding them. He knew Elara was right. A whisper needed the weight of stone. Making his decision, he gathered a few meager supplies. His sharpest flint-tipped spear, a stone knife, a small pouch with a strip of dried deer meat and some dried berries, and a length of braided sinew rope. He avoided the main entrance, instead slipping through a narrow fissure at the back of the great cave that led out onto a high, precarious ledge. It was a dangerous path, but it would keep him from being seen. As he squeezed through the tight opening, leaving the familiar scent of smoke and humanity behind, he felt a profound sense of loneliness. He was not just leaving the cave. He was stepping away from his tribe, choosing a path of solitary knowledge over shared belief. The air outside was cold and thin. He followed the cliff line, moving with the quiet grace he had learned from years of watching foxes and weasels. The world felt alien and hostile without the comforting presence of his tribe. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind, sounded like the footstep of a monster. He forced himself to focus, to read the language of the forest as he always had. He headed north, towards the towering granite peaks that formed the valley's headwall. The higher he climbed, the more the landscape changed. The familiar woods gave way to hardy, wind-stunted pines and bare rock. This was the territory of eagles and mountain goats, a world of stone and sky. He found the trail the herds had taken, and the sight of it confirmed his fears. It was not a migration, it was a panicked exodus. The tracks were churned and chaotic, the ground torn up by thousands of hooves all driving in one direction. Up, towards the treacherous high pass, a desperate gamble to escape the valley. As he followed the edge of the herd's trail, he began to see the signs Alara had promised. A massive pine tree, easily 5 men thick at its base, had been scored with colossal claw marks. They started at the ground and reached up an impossible height, stripping away bark and gouging deep into the wood. Cale stood at the base of the tree and looked up. The highest mark was 3 times his own height. He imagined the creature rearing up, its immense body blotting out the sky. A shudder of pure, primal fear ran through him. He pressed on, his resolve hardened by terror. He had to warn them. A short while later, he found something even more chilling. Lying in a jumble of rocks was the carcass of a shadow cat. Its neck was snapped, its skull crushed, and one of its formidable saber teeth was broken off. But it had not been eaten. It had been swatted aside, killed with casual, dismissive force, like a man might kill a fly. Cale stared at the dead predator, at the broken symbol of its power, and understood. In this new world, even the shadow cats were prey. Finally, as the bone-white sun began its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the landscape, he reached the Weeping Caves. They were a series of dark mouths in the cliff face, named for the constant, slow drip of mineral-laden water that left pale, tear-like streaks on the rock. The place felt ancient and wrong. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of wet stone and something else, something musky and wild, a powerful, rank scent that made his instincts scream danger. He remembered Alara's words, "Look for what is broken." He moved cautiously from one cave entrance to the next. Most were undisturbed, their floors carpeted with the dust of ages. But then he saw it. The entrance to the largest cave was different. A huge slab of rock, the size of a sleeping bison, had once partially blocked the opening. Now it lay tossed aside, a deep groove plowed in the earth where it had been moved. The edges of the cave entrance itself were scarred and broken, chunks of stone having been smashed away. This was not the work of wind or water. This was the work of unimaginable force. Something had broken its way out. This was the great-grandfather's hibernation den. And it was empty. Cale stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had his proof. The creature was real. It had awoken from its ancient slumber and smashed its way out into their world. This was the imbalance. This was the truth. He had to get back. He turned, his mind racing, already planning how he would convince Boren, how he could make them understand. But as he turned, his foot slipped on a patch of wet moss. He flailed, his spear clattering against the rock, and fell hard. A sharp, searing pain shot up his leg. He looked down and saw his ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. He tried to put weight on it and cried out, a wave of blackness and pain washing over him. He was high on the northern ridge, miles from his home, with a broken ankle. The sun was setting, and the second night of the festival, the deepest, darkest night, was about to begin. Far below, he could almost imagine the firelight of his home, the gathering of his people. Their voices rising in the frenzied chants Rorik was teaching them. They were preparing to march out into the darkness to confront a demon. And he, the only one who knew the real name of the monster they were calling, was lying helpless and broken in the heart of its territory. The musky scent of the beast was thick in the air, a promise on the cold wind. It was close, and it was awake. Pain was a world unto itself. It washed over Cale in relentless, throbbing waves, radiating from the shattered bones in his ankle. With every beat of his heart, a fresh surge of agony made the world swim and dissolve into a gray haze. For a time, he lay where he had fallen, curled on the cold, damp stone, a small, broken thing at the mouth of the empty lair. The bone-white day bled into a bruised, purple twilight, and the cold, which had been a mere discomfort, began to seep into him, a predatory chill that sought the warmth of his very marrow. He knew with a chilling certainty that to stay here was to die. He would either freeze to death or the great bear, drawn by the scent of his weakness, would return to its den and find him. The thought of that creature, the casual destroyer of the shadow cat, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him that was stronger, for a moment, than the pain. He had to move. He had to warn them. Using his spear as a crutch, he dragged himself to his feet. The scream that tore from his throat was raw and animalistic as his full weight settled on the broken ankle. The world went black for a beat, then returned in a nauseating swirl of stars and stone. He leaned heavily against the cave wall, panting, his body slick with a cold sweat. He looked down at his foot. It was already swelling, a grotesque, misshapen lump inside his hide wrap. Despair was a dark, suffocating blanket. It whispered to him that his quest was futile, that his tribe was doomed, that his fate was to die alone on this desolate ridge. He thought of Alara's calm, blind face, of Borin's worried frown, even of Rorik's arrogant sneer. He thought of the children huddled by the fire, their faces full of fear. The despair receded, replaced by a grim, stubborn resolve. He would not die here. His whisper would be heard, even if it was his last. The journey down was a nightmare descent into a hell of pain and darkness. The second night of the dying moon was upon them, and the sky was a void, utterly starless and black. He could not walk. He was forced to crawl, dragging his useless leg behind him. He used his spear to probe the darkness ahead, to steady himself, to pull his body forward. Every rock was a razor, every thorny bush a clawed hand that tore at his skin and clothes. The agonizing journey that had taken him a few hours to ascend became an epic struggle of inches and feet on the way down. His mind began to play tricks on him. The wind moaning through the jagged peaks sounded like the low growl of the bear. The shadows cast by the rocks twisted into monstrous shapes. He was consumed by thirst, his throat a desert of dust and pain. He ate a handful of snow, the intense cold a brief, shocking relief. He was running on pure will, his body screaming for him to stop, to surrender to the coming oblivion. As he crawled, his hand brushed against something smooth and hard in the dirt. Crying out as he shifted his weight, he dug at it with his fingers. It was a piece of flint, but not the gray flint of their valley. This was a different kind, a creamy white, almost luminous in the profound dark. He recognized it from Alara's stories. Starstone. It was said to hold the light of the sky within it and to spark truer and hotter than any other rock. The old ones had prized it. Finding it here in his moment of deepest despair felt like a sign, a small gift from the ancestors he was trying to honor. He tucked the precious stone into his pouch, a tiny, hard kernel of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Hours bled into a timeless eternity of agony. He lost all sense of direction, navigating by the feel of the slope, praying he was still heading towards the valley floor. He was delirious with pain and exhaustion when he first saw it. A faint, flickering orange glow far below, reflected against the low-hanging mist. The fire of the great cave, his home. The sight gave him a final, desperate surge of strength. He was close. He pushed himself harder, ignoring the screaming protests of his body. His eyes fixed on that tiny beacon of life in the immense, consuming blackness. He finally tumbled out of the rocks and onto the familiar soft earth of the lower valley, not far from the river. He was still a long way from the cave, but he was on flat ground. He could hear them now, a sound that chilled him more than the night air. It was a rhythmic, guttural chanting, punctuated by the stamping of feet and the clattering of spears against shields of hide. Rorik's ritual was underway. He could feel the vibrations through the ground, a deep, resonant drumming that spoke of bloodlust and manufactured courage. He was too late. They were already preparing to leave. With a final, desperate act, he gathered all his remaining strength. He filled his lungs with the frigid air and shouted, his voice a raw, broken croak. "Boren! Stop! Danger!" His voice was swallowed by the chanting, a pathetic whisper against a rising storm. He tried again, screaming until his throat felt like it was tearing. But it was no use. The ritual had taken them. They were lost in its fervor. Inside the great cave, the scene was one of primal frenzy. The central fire roared, fed by dry pine logs, casting frantic, dancing shadows on the painted walls. The hunters, their chests and faces smeared with stripes of red ochre and black charcoal, moved as one body around the flames. Rorik stood in the center, his powerful frame gleaming with sweat in the firelight. He held a ceremonial spear, its tip wickedly sharp, its shaft adorned with raven feathers. His voice was a hypnotic roar, leading the chant, a simple, repetitive verse about the strength of the spear and the courage of the hunter. The men's eyes were glazed, their movements jerky, caught in the grip of a collective trance. They were no longer individuals. They were the tribe as predator, a single entity of violence and will, preparing to hurl themselves at the darkness. Boren stood to one side, his face a mask of conflict. He watched his hunters, his practical mind warring with the potent, intoxicating power of the ritual. The fear and hunger of the past weeks had been alchemized into this single, focused point of rage. He felt the pull of it himself, the seductive simplicity of meeting a threat with overwhelming force. Was this not the way of their people? Was this not how they had survived? Alara sat in her alcove, a still point in the swirling chaos. She did not watch the dance. She listened. She listened to the fire, to the wind outside the cave, to the strained, frantic rhythm of the hunters' hearts. And she heard something wrong. This was not the strength of the ancestors. This was the brittle bravado of fear. The chanting reached a crescendo. Rorik raised his spear. "Now," he bellowed, "we take the fire's heart. We carry its courage into the dark. We show the demon we are the Sunstone people, and we are not afraid. For the Hunt Mother. For the tribe." A great roar went up. The hunters surged forward, each one preparing to dip the tip of their spear into the sacred fire, a symbolic act of taking its power with them on their hunt for the demon. It was at that moment that a figure stumbled and fell into the circle of firelight at the cave's entrance. He was a creature of mud and blood, his clothes torn to shreds, his face a pale mask of agony. He collapsed onto the stone floor, a broken spear clattering beside him. The chanting faltered and died. The hunters froze, their trance shattered by the shocking apparition. "Kale!" Boren cried, rushing forward. Rorik stared, his face contorted with fury at the interruption. "What is this? You dare disrupt the sacred ritual?" Kale pushed himself up onto his elbows, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He ignored Rorik, his eyes locking on Boren. "Don't go!" he rasped, his voice hoarse. "It's a trap, not a spirit. A beast, a great bear, from the old stories." He fumbled at his pouch, his fingers clumsy and slick with his own blood. He pulled out the proof he had nearly died to retrieve, the massive, broken saber tooth of the Shadowcat. He threw it onto the ground in front of Boren. It landed with a heavy clack on the stone. "Found this on the northern ridge," Kale panted. "The bear killed a Shadowcat, swatted it aside. It's not hunting for food. It's clearing its territory. The herds are fleeing from it. That's why they're gone. If you go out there, making noise, covered in blood, it will find you. You will be leading it straight to us." A heavy silence descended on the cave, broken only by Kale's labored breathing and the crackle of the fire. The hunters stared at the broken tooth, a potent symbol of the valley's deadliest predator, now rendered as fragile as a twig. The story it told was simple and utterly terrifying. Something was in their valley that could break a Shadowcat. Rorik, seeing his authority and his ritual crumbling, let out a roar of contempt. "Lies! Tricks! The boy is a coward. He broke his own ankle to avoid the hunt, and he brings back a broken tooth he found in the dirt. He fears the spirits, so he invents a beast. Are you men, or are you children, to be frightened by a coward's tale? He tried to restart the chant, but the fervor was gone. The men looked from the broken tooth to Kale's shattered leg, to the raw, desperate truth in his eyes. Doubt had been planted, a seed of cold reason in the fevered soil of their fear. I saw its lair, Kale pressed, his voice gaining a little strength. The weeping caves, cave entrance, blocked by a rock the size of a bison, smashed open. From the inside, Sawake, Boren. Alara was right. The world is changing. Boren picked up the tooth. He felt its weight, its deadly sharpness. He had seen 100 shadowcats in his life. He knew their power. He looked at Kale's mangled leg, a clear and terrible injury. This was no coward's ploy. He turned his gaze to Alara, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. Boren's decision was made. He dropped the tooth and raised his hand. The hunt is over, he commanded, his voice ringing with the old authority. Rorik, stand down. We do not go into the darkness tonight. No! Rorik bellowed, his face purple with rage. He felt his power, his whole worldview slipping away. You are a fool, old man. Led by a blind crone and a crippled boy. The spirits demand this. To refuse now is to invite our doom. He turned, his eyes wild, and in a final, desperate act of defiance, he lunged towards the great fire. I will go alone. I will show you what a true hunter is. He thrust his ceremonial spear deep into the heart of the roaring fire. But in his rage he was clumsy. The dry raven feathers adorning the shaft instantly caught alight. The fire, hungry for fuel, leaped up the spear shaft with a hungry roar. Rorik cried out in surprise and pain, dropping the burning spear. It rolled into a pile of dry hides and spare bedding near the cave wall. In a heartbeat, the fire erupted. Flames shot up the wall, igniting the dry moss and the generations of animal fat residue that coated the stone. The fire that had been their heart, their source of warmth and safety, had turned against them. Thick, black, choking smoke filled the upper reaches of the cave. Panic exploded. People screamed, stumbling back from the rapidly spreading wall of flame. Out! Everyone out! Boren roared, shoving people towards the entrance. The tribe scrambled into the cold, dark night, their ritual forgotten, their home, their sanctuary for time immemorial, being consumed behind them. In the chaos, Kale was knocked down, his broken leg twisting under him. He cried out, but his voice was lost in the din. He saw the fire racing along the wall, directly towards the section where the tribe stored its precious, meager supply of dried meat and berries, their only hope for surviving the winter. He saw something else, too. Alara was still in her alcove, disoriented by the noise and the smoke, her path to the exit blocked by the fire. Without a second thought, Kale began to crawl, the pain in his ankle a distant, unimportant signal. He crawled towards Alara. This way, to the back, he yelled, pointing towards the fissure he had used to escape. Boren, seeing their plight, rushed back in. The stores, he yelled to the other hunters. Save the food. But it was Rorik who acted first. The shock of his catastrophic mistake seemed to have broken his fanatical trance. He stared at the fire he had started, at the terror on the faces of his people. In his eyes, a flicker of something new appeared. Not pride, not rage, but a terrible, dawning shame. With a wordless roar, he charged not towards the exit, but towards the burning food stores. He grabbed a heavy, water-soaked hide and began beating at the flames, trying desperately to undo the damage he had wrought. Kale reached Alara, who was coughing, her face streaked with soot. The back way, he gasped, pulling her arm. Together, they began to make their way towards the narrow fissure as Boren and the other hunters joined Rorik in a desperate, losing battle against the inferno. Just as Kale and Alara reached the fissure, a terrible groaning sound echoed from above. The intense heat of the fire had caused a massive slab of stone in the ceiling to crack. With a deafening roar, A section of the cave roof collapsed, burying the food stores, the fire, and Rorik under tons of rock. The surviving members of the tribe, huddled in the freezing darkness outside, stared in horror at the smoking, partially collapsed entrance to their home. Their sanctuary was gone. Their winter stores were gone. Their strongest hunter was gone. They had nothing left but the clothes on their backs and the terror in their hearts. The second night of the festival had brought not a symbolic death, but a real and devastating one. Kale, leaning against the cliff face with Alara beside him, felt the full weight of the catastrophe. In saving them from the beast, he had inadvertently led them to this. His whisper had been heard, but the shout of the fire had been louder. As the tribe wept and despaired in the cold, a low, guttural sound rolled through the valley. It was a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The great bear, drawn by the commotion, the smoke, the scent of fear, panic seized the tribe anew. They were exposed, homeless and weaponless, with the monster from the old stories now hunting them in the dark. It was then that Alara spoke, her voice frail but clear in the sudden, terrified hush. The fire is not the heart, Kale. The story is the heart. The home is not the cave. The people are the home. She turned her blind eyes towards the weeping tribe. We are the Sunstone people. We were born of darkness and cold. The first mother did not die in the snow. The first father did not flee the beasts. They endured. They learned. They survived. The story is not over. Her words, spoken with such unshakable conviction, cut through their despair. It was the great story not as a memory, but as a command. Kale looked at his people huddled and frightened. He looked at the smoking ruin of his home, and he looked into the profound darkness where the monster lurked. Alara was right. He remembered the piece of starstone in his pouch. A small, hard thing that could create a spark. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The river of teeth, he said, his voice finding a new strength he didn't know he possessed. There are caves on the other side. Smaller but defensible. We have to cross. Borin looked at him, his face aged a decade in the last hour. He saw not a boy but a leader. He nodded. How do we make a fire? Kale reached into his pouch and pulled out the starstone. He held it up. The ancestors have given us a gift. He then looked at Borin. And we have a new story to tell. A story of a night of fire and smoke. A story of a hunter who lost his way, but in the end, tried to save his people. A story of how we did not die. Borin looked at the collapsed cave where Rorik lay buried. He understood. Rorik's memory would not be one of failure, but of sacrifice. It was a story that would heal, not divide. The crossing of the river in the dark was a terrifying ordeal, but they moved as one, helping the children and the wounded, their shared purpose forging them into something stronger than they had been before. They found a series of small, shallow caves on the far cliff, just as Kale had remembered. They were cold and damp, a poor substitute for the great cave, but they were a sanctuary. As the first, faint hint of gray dawn touched the eastern peaks, heralding the end of the long night and the third and final day of the festival, Kale knelt at the mouth of their new home. With trembling, soot-stained hands, he struck the starstone against the flint of his knife. A spark flew, then another. On the third try, a tiny spark landed in the tinder of dry moss he had gathered. He blew on it gently, nurturing it, his heart pounding with a hope that was as fierce and as fragile as the tiny flame. The flame caught. It grew, a small, beautiful flower of orange light in the vast, cold gray. The tribe gathered around, their faces illuminated, drawn to its warmth. It was a pathetic fire compared to the roaring inferno that had destroyed their home, but it was theirs. It was a new beginning. As the slender, perfect crescent of the new moon rose in the pre-dawn sky, a silver promise of renewal, they looked at each other. They had lost everything, yet they were still here. They were hungry, wounded, and homeless, but they were together. The festival of the new moon had been a trial by fire, a stripping away of everything they thought they were. But in the ashes, They had found the true, unbreakable core of their tribe. Not a place, not a ritual, but each other. And a story that was still being written, in a new home under a new moon.